Great games at your table. I'm Jonathan Albin, and this is Nikos RPG, and we are in the Game Master Soapbox tonight, big time. I want to talk to you about conflict simulation and how we can actually reinvigorate our play sessions so that we get more out of every engagement.
Absorbing damage is the name of the game. From the claws of monsters or the heat from a ball of flame, or strength in numbers is a roll of the dice.
Alrighty, so good evening. We are going to be, as I said, talking about consim, and this is not a terminology that's currently used and hasn't probably been bandied about for some time. It was definitely hip and cool when I was a youngster to discuss consim, or conflict simulation. And this has everything to do with the roots of role-play games being in classic war games and the like, and really talks about how we can engage the players in our sessions in a way that the story can make sense and can be reached in ways that we haven't done before. Now, the first way we want to do this, of course, is to establish ourselves in a session 0 talking about the very issues of conflict. And we did an entire episode on session 0s yesterday and what kind of things you might expect in your game sessions going forward. But let's get to our particulars today. But before we do that, make sure you go down below and press all the buttons so that the algorithm knows that you're part of our audience. Okay, so when we talk about conflict simulation, we're really talking about how players interact with the world, how players interact with the environment, and how players interact with the monsters. And there are really 6 areas of interaction, and most role-play games fundamentally focus on one. Everyone is aware of the combat systems that are out there in the role-play games mechanisms, and there are certain skills that are leaned on fairly heavily in the current crop, if you will, of role-play games. And this limited number of skills really is kind of the crisis point for what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to talk about the 6 areas of interaction, and we're going to be addressing not only the 6 areas of interaction, but also the various and variety of solutions that can come out of a game session. So, in the case of Nikos RPG, we utilize these terms. Of course, you'll see somewhat of an analogy to classic attributes that a character might have. You have your brilliance, which is your intellect, your wisdom, your cleverness, kind of all rolled into one. You have your cognizance, which is your awareness, alertness, observation, all of those rolled into one. You have your grace, which is your agility, dexterity, mobility, and the like. Then you've got presence, which is your tenacity, arrogance, social interaction, and the like. Then you've got resilience, which is how tough you are, how resilient you are, what kind of a constitution you might have. And then finally you have the resolve. And while Nikos really focuses on these in a different way, consider resolve to sort of be your interaction with magical effects and your ability to hold your own even when things get a little supernatural. The idea of having these different arenas for conflict mean that we have not just a combat mechanism that deals with just the physical output, but we're also talking about how to interact with individuals in other ways. In other words, if you're having a duel of wits, there's a way to do that. If you're talking about who is going to be more astute and a better hunter, you have a way to do that. If you're talking about which is a better swordsman and has better agility, grace, etc., you have that. And by having these multiplicities of arenas, you give the game a richer depth than it might have if you have the classic singular mechanism. We'll come more into that in a moment. Ooh, jumped ahead of myself. In addition to these arenas, we also have different types of conflict resolution. And in a standard role-playing game, you fundamentally have your combat system and your skills checks, and that fundamentally is it. And that skills check limitation really does hurt in a case where you have a limited number of skills. Now, granted, if you had an infinite or near infinite number of potential skills, the water might get muddied. And so by being able to define these as narrowly as we did by looking at the different particular arenas, we're giving ourselves a solid foundation to work from. So now what are these kinds of checks? Now, these conflicts that I'm going to be talking about covers the gamut, and they are not only held to a specific type of conflict, but also a particular style of interaction. So, for example, I'll walk through these really quickly. Checks are simply a comparison between a player's dice roll and their skill in a particular field. This could be a search of a library. This might be the ability to gather information from the local community. This could be the valuation of a weapon or a determination of assessment in terms of the value of an item. Checks are the simplified form. Then you go to the challenges, and challenges are the same as checks, but are usually done in a situation of duress. You're put in a place where the check is under some form of pressure and therefore resides as a challenge. Next would be the contests, and this is where parallel skills that are complementary or antecedent antithetic to each other can be compared. So the idea of having one person have the ability to hide and another person's ability to find, and rolling the checks to see those. Competition is where you've got multiple abilities rolling against the same attribute just to see who's first, second, third. And then, of course, finally, combat. And this is not just physical combat, but this might be verbal combat. It might be moral high ground. It might be a matter of looking at the agility, the dancing ability. And you literally could have a dance off in this case because your attribute is rolled against as if it was a combat. The next thing that you'll find is that there is a graduation of skill based on the merits of relative success. Now, most roleplay games don't have a particular angle on this, but Nikos RPG in particular does, because you have a multiplicity of potential outcomes, as I'll show you here in the next slide. So when we are talking about the relative success, if you look at a standard system, you're only going to see three. You're going to see failure, and you're going to see normal, and you'll see complete. And I'm pointing in the wrong direction on my arrows. But the point is that your failure is bad. Of course, many systems use a critical system, whether it be a critical fumble using a natural one, or whether it's just a simple loss. At the other end of the spectrum, you can have a critical success or a complete success on the top end of the chart. And so by having both ends covered, you have fundamentally three. You have either success, failure, catastrophe, or a complete success. And that's really what it comes down to. In the case of Nikos RPG, we also add in the concept of a wild success, where you've gotten additional advantage because you did something particularly well. And then, of course, you have partial, wherein maybe you didn't get all that you wanted, but at least you got a piece of the action, so to speak. And by having a broader spectrum, you can more clearly determine success, failure by looking where it is on this particular scale. And the reason to have the variety is from a thematic standpoint. If you are playing a tabletop miniatures game, you don't necessarily have to have this, because you are utilizing miniatures as an attrition model, and therefore you're removing numbers of potential attackers, which reduces the relative success of the unit. And so this is really particularly useful in a cinematic and theater of the mind environment where you need to have a more compelling justification for your narrative when you're GMing compared to just the random conditions bearing themselves out. Now, these lead to, therefore, the next element of this, which is the concept of simplifying conditions. So, in other words, if you've rolled a partial success and someone else has rolled a relative, a normal success, then how do you modify this? And one of the ways is through the idea of simplified conditions. So, in other words, you've succeeded slightly better than your opponent, so you can say that they've been pushed off their footing, or perhaps they've lost a little bit of distance on you, and therefore you can narratively explain the differences without going into much detail. Of course, when there are radically different levels of the successes, you want to be able to show that in more detail. And when you talk about relative detail, then what you're talking about is if you've rolled a complete success versus an opponent that's only gotten a partial. There's a big gap between those two, relativistically speaking, and so therefore by allowing for additional conditions to be placed upon the failure or the one who's achieved a lesser success, then you are giving a more gravitas to that success, and therefore making it feel more real when they can see the comparison between the numbers. Of course, all of this is compelled by what is considered to be a basic dice rule in any role-playing game, and the illusion, perhaps, is that the dice roll is a requirement, but the reality is that if a game master has determined from the actions of the game there is no need for a die roll, then no die roll is required. And this basic die rule means that if the players have a foregone conclusion of success because they've outthought, outplanned, outmastered the nemesis, then you don't need to roll a dice for them. They have succeeded in whatever it is they're attempting to do. And when you perhaps oversimplifies this, and I don't think it's necessarily oversimplification, but if you do consider this to be oversimplification, all you're doing is precluding a lot of fundamentally useless die rolling that would have been required by playing otherwise. And I would establish that if you're telling the story as a game master and the players have outwitted you, there's no reason to waste everybody's time. Simply provide them with the narrative on how their wisdom and their prowess has succeeded. Now, if you want to throw in some dice rolls, you can do so, but just realize that there is never a requirement for the dice roll to be placed unless the game master determines a reason for it to be. All right, so I just went through it really fast. And one thing I do want to mention is the fact that when you are looking at the variety of conflicts, for example, if you are playing in a, say, a Regency concept world, a Shakespearean world, if you will, then perhaps there will be more intrigue rolls and less actual weapons combat. Or perhaps weapons combat will be more stylized and dramatic because it will be in the form of a duel. And by having the genre influence the style of play, you also have an influence which die rolls you need. Now, I've mentioned all of this to say, I guess my grandfather would say, I told you all of that to say this. When you are a storyteller and a game master and you are endeavoring to make your session particularly exciting to your players, try to find nuances where the genre shines through in your story so that the players feel it. If you are playing, for example, a down in the mud and dirty fight scene, that may be conduct unbecoming of, for example, officers in the military, and this may not be the proper way to resolve it. And so just realize that there are more ways to interact than those that you're limited to in a traditional role-play mechanism, simply by choosing your battles metaphorically as well as empirically. So I want to thank you for being here for tonight. We will see you in the next episode. I'm Jonathan Albin, and go play.